Welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. My name is Dr. Patty Robbie Keller, and I'm the Sports Administration Program Director at Boston College. I manage the Masters in Sports Administration. What I love about our program and leading our program is that all our faculty work in sports. Our students get the excellent experience that they bring to the table, the education, and their network. So when our students leave our program, most of them are already set up with a job in sports. We give you open opportunities to find so many different avenues to work in sport. Our program is very explosive and dynamic, and we hope you come and check us out. Our entire program is $42,000 a year, and it can be done in 18 months, online or in person. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the episode.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at 1Q Leadership. I am joined by Professor Brian Shannon. Professor Shannon is the Horn Distinguished Professor of Law in the Texas Tech School of Law, and also serves as a faculty athletic rep there at Texas Tech. Greetings, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Ty. Glad to be with you.
So you've been professoring for, since the 80s, I guess, right there at Texas Tech?
Yeah, since about 1988, 35 years now.
For a while there, yeah. Been over 15 years as the FAR.
Right.
So, in my mind, you have a lot of thoughts of college athletics in terms of experience, in terms of seeing where this thing has been, where it is now, and where it's going. And then also in terms of what you do in academia. Tell me the areas that you teach and the areas that you research.
Sure, glad to. I teach contracts every year. I also taught criminal law most of the years that I've been teaching. A lot of my policy and research work has been in mental health law, largely with the overlap in the criminal justice system, but
really?
Not exclusively.
Really? So that's interesting, just to kind of veer off a little bit real quick about academia. So your research is a little different than what you teach. Tell me about that.
That's right. In my early years, I was also teaching a mental health law course called Law and Psychiatry. Once I became our faculty athletics rep, though, I tried to continue teaching a full load, and they offered me course release. And the first year I figured out I should have taken them up on it. So I've cut back on some of the courses I've taught, but I've continued with the mental health law research.
Oh, okay, I see. So then tell me about mental health law research. Give me a little bit of a description of what that is.
Yeah, so there are a number of differing areas of mental health law, from civil law, civil commitments, emergency detentions. A lot of my work's been on the criminal justice side. We were finding that many people with serious mental illness weren't getting appropriate treatment and were getting caught up in our jails and prisons.
Yeah. So my mother grew up in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Grandmother was in the outskirts of Ypsilanti, and everybody always said, well, since they closed the hospital, and they were talking about the hospital, I guess it had hospitals for people with mental illness, or since they closed the hospitals or something. Was there a point when things were government funded, like facilities or something? Because that was something everybody always talked about up there in Michigan.
Yeah, we saw, really going back to the 60s and 70s, there were many people with serious mental illness would end up in state facilities, state hospitals. A lot of them were not very good places.
Yeah, I've heard.
And so kind of in the era of civil rights litigation, in addition to issues relating to race and gender, other forms of discrimination, some lawyers also challenged these approaches. Well, one of the last acts that President Kennedy signed before he was assassinated was a Community Mental Health Centers Act that created a mechanism for funding for community-based mental health centers. The dream was you would start shutting down the institutions, you would have more community-based care. Unfortunately, a lot of the funding didn't follow. Right. So we saw a lot of the state hospitals being shut down or greatly reducing their patient size, and quite honestly, in a good way, that they're better places for true treatment. But we didn't see the dollars flow into the community for community health care. And so we've unfortunately seen almost a trans-institutionalization into the criminal justice system.
Oh, wow. Okay. They shut those down. They didn't provide the community resource.
Right.
And then you just see people.
And today we're catching up. We're trying to do more with additional mental health resources for community treatment and getting people identified early into services if needed.
Yeah. And the stigma isn't as bad as it was back then.
Yeah, significant changes. And my interest in the area really stemmed from having a family member, a younger brother who got ill when he was a senior in college. And thankfully a well-meaning, caring roommate got scared about his conduct, called my parents, said, I'm really worried about my brother. And they intervened. What we often see, though, with a symptom of some of the serious mental illnesses is a symptom called anosognosia. It means a lack of insight. You know, when your leg hurts or you've got, a problem with your arm or wrist, your brain's telling you there's a problem. Unfortunately, with these mental illnesses, there's a lack of insight of even knowing anything's wrong.
Wow.
And so then there's an unwillingness to get help. And you'll see individuals say, oh, nothing wrong with me, something wrong with you.
Self-responsibility, which
and so we've got civil systems in place that the state can intervene with what's called an emergency intervention or emergency detention to try and get somebody in a mental health crisis at least seen by a doc and possibly into services.
Yeah, which is excellent, right?
Yeah.
16 years as a faculty athletics rep there at Texas Tech. And over the last probably 16 years, we've seen where mental health has gone from this stigma thing in the community to where people are acknowledging that, hey, there may be something, taking the self-responsibility, personal responsibility, to even where we see it where student athletes, well, students in general, but definitely student athletes are saying, hey, we need something for us.
Yeah, we've seen a sea change in an era of great stigma where people didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to raise the possibility that there was something going on, something wrong. Today, in fact, Dr. Hainline mentioned this at the convention, from his starting point in 2013 as the chief medical officer, at his very first convention, student athletes, the SAC group, was clamoring for more support on mental health issues. And that has only increased in that. And I've been impressed in my FAR role that top issue at National SAC when I was on the D1 Council, top issue the last several years within the Big 12 SAC has been, let's do more about mental health issues. And so I think it's great. It's being student demanded and sought.
Which is excellent. I wonder, is there any aspect of your research that may overlap with student athlete mental health?
I think there's some overlap, and we've got to keep in mind that there are differences between people dealing with mental health challenges versus someone with serious mental illness.
Okay.
And sometimes it's hard to know delineate a difference because you can have an individual who may be depressed who might also have serious depressive illness, but by and large, I mean, the mental health issues that student athletes are dealing with, thankfully, are not serious mental illnesses. Doesn't mean they're not important and serious, but like college is a time of transition to begin with.
Yeah.
And then you've got a student athlete that probably wouldn't have been recruited if he or she had not been tops in his sport in high school, and suddenly they're not, or they might be coping with injury, they might be coping with gender identity recognition, that they're, should they come out, if they're gay, if they're an international student, coping with being in a new country. And so all of these different pressures can come to bear. Obviously, COVID didn't help any of us.
Yeah.
We're coming out of that, but some of our student athletes who are having that extra COVID year experienced significant challenges too.
I think that's interesting. Mental health challenges versus mental illness.
Yeah,
That's real interesting to me.
Dr. Hainline said something interesting at a prior conference when he'd spoken to the FARS. He said he had gone to a national conference of athletics trainers, and he just asked a show of hands, how many of you have an emergency action plan in the event of a cardiac incident happening at one of your athletics facilities? Every hand goes up.
Yeah.
And he said, how many of you have rehearsed or have a plan in place for a psychiatric emergency? He said maybe 5 hands went up.
Wow, yeah.
And so one of the things the NCAA has done is, through its development of mental health best practices, has created an expectation that member institutions have an emergency psychiatric crisis plan in place and have rehearsed it. So what to do in that situation if somebody is in psychosis, threatening to harm himself or others? Are there coordination, work with the community to bring out, say, a mobile crisis outreach team from a community mental health center? Doesn't mean anybody in athletics has to fix it or solve the issue, but we need to know how to respond.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah.
I wonder if there are things that are being put in place by the NCAA that, either by the time we publish this conversation or, after the conversation, before the conversation, things that may come out that actually, we can applaud that will help, in addition to what you just said.
I think when they first developed the mental health best practices several years ago, it was scientific based. They had input from a number of the major entities out there, National Alliance on Mental Illness, an array of groups. And for example, one shift in the new model is there's an expectation of screening individuals when they first come to campus. Well, that's screening a lot of times 18-year-olds, but some of these mental health issues start to arise after someone's
Well, you mentioned
there.
Your brother was senior year in college, right?
Senior year in college. Some of the serious mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression often have an onset late teens, early 20s. And so one of the changes in the NCAA approach is to permit and have screenings at different times with standardized types of screening instruments to try and flag, is there something here that we ought to look at further? There's also been an expectation that each institution will have somebody who's a licensed mental health professional or more, which I think is very important, right?
100%, yeah. Is there, and you'll have to help me, and this may be a medical question, but those things you mentioned, schizophrenia and the things the onset things that come in the early 20s or late teens, could those be genetic?
They're definitely a genetic component. They've identified with bipolar disorder a gene marker. You have to keep in mind, we probably know about as much about the brain today that we knew about the rest of the body 100 years ago.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But the diagnostics, the studies, the analysis is so much better now to be able to have brain imaging and other sorts of approaches and tests. But for example, with schizophrenia, they've done some studies of identical twins, and you'd think, identical twins, they've got the same genes. With siblings generally, whereas in the general population there may be a 1% possibility that somebody might get schizophrenia, which is still a lot, 1 in 100. With siblings, generally it might be 2%. With identical twins, the concordance is 50%.
Wow. Yeah.
So there's definitely something genetic.
Yeah.
What they're trying to study now is, well, why did it trigger in this twin and not the other?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not clearly all genetic.
So then in the testing, are they testing gene markers, or are they?
I don't think it's gotten that developed.
They're not that far yet.
At this point. Often the diagnosis is more tied to the nature of the person's symptoms and then how they may respond to certain medications.
Oh, so it's really until something shows up. we don't necessarily know anything kind of situation.
Often. And so, for example, there's a lot of stigma around schizophrenia. It's some of the old kind of poor images from media and all. It's not split personality. It's not three faces of Eve or Sybil or anything like that. It's a thought disease. Their thinking is disordered. They may be experiencing auditory or visual hallucinations, feelings of paranoia, and it can become quite acute in terms of psychosis. On the other hand, we now know it's imminently treatable if somebody's identified and gets onto the medications. The medications today are so much better than they were at one time. Same with depressive illness, bipolar. There are available treatments, and it's not just throwing pills. There's also, like dealing with any other kind of disease, somebody has to, I think it's going to do better if they understand I've got a disease, I ought to take my meds, etc.
If they own up to the personal
and unfortunately, there's not a cure, just like there's no cure for diabetes. But we know that with regular treatment,
you can manage.
It's very manageable.
Which is interesting. So in terms of your role as faculty athletics rep, when we do our jobs and whatever responsibilities we have, we always do our best to do it at a high level, whatever it is, right? And if you're an overachiever, where's the line to overachieve? I'm always going to try to overachieve. But sometimes there are things that just interest us, and we always find ourselves going towards those things. Is this area the thing that, as a FAR, in addition to all the other things that FARs are responsible, is this one of the areas that you find yourself leaning into?
I do think so. I mean, one, because I've had a personal interest.
Exactly.
But two, one of the things that I think we're tasked with as FARs is to try and have an appreciation and support for student-athlete welfare.
Right.
And I'm not saying ADs and coaches don't, but we're not being judged on wins and losses, and we want to position ourselves as advocates for the student-athletes in that sense, and use our position in trying to, if need be, persuade the AD or the president, the director of sports medicine, that, hey, we really need to have a more robust array of offerings with respect to services. I will say, and I can only speak for Texas Tech largely and other universities in the Big 12, we've certainly seen a lot more emphasis in our athletics departments of having, not just because the NCAA said so, but to have mental health licensed professionals, have that access for our student athletes, let it be known that it's available. Unfortunately, our campuses are struggling as student bodies have grown. The services available across campus might be challenging too. Now, one positive, I guess, if we're going to find one about COVID, is in this area, telepsych expanded considerably. And that's also giving universities and other providers opportunities to see more people who might be in need. And I'm not saying most student athletes are going to have a serious mental illness. In fact, the opposite is true. But they may well benefit from having somebody they can talk to and coping with the mental health challenges of daily living and being a student athlete under the spotlight. Another thing, one of the I understand one of the focuses of the new revised mental health best practices is looking at additional pressures on student athletes in the sports betting area, in the NIL arena, more, I guess, aggressive actors on social media with, singling out or trying to humiliate somebody if something hadn't gone well in a prior game. And so it's creating even more pressures on our student athletes.
Which is crazy. Well, Brian, this has been an excellent conversation. I really, in terms of understanding FARs, and especially when you talk about being able to overlap your interests of study, with what you do and another hat you wear at the university, it sounds like you value the responsibility that you have, and also definitely at Texas Tech. But in general, I think college athletics it's better for having people such as you in positions such as these. And I really appreciate you joining us here on One Question Leadership Podcast.
Well, Tai, thank you very much. Glad to be with you and great to see you again.
Yes, sir. That was Brian Shannon. He is the Horn Distinguished Professor of Law at Texas Tech School of Law. And he's also the faculty athletic representative for Texas Tech Athletics. And of course, I am Tai Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.